address. I want to welcome everybody and thank you so much for coming to our China and the Left, a Socialist Forum conference. We're very excited to be co-organizing this with the Qiao Collective. I also want to thank our co-sponsors for this event, Monthly Review and Code Pink. My name is Mia. I am a staff member at the People's Forum on the research team, and the People's Forum is a movement incubator and political education space, and we are hoping to unite working class movements across the world. It feels like there has never been a more important time to talk about China. For those who follow world geopolitics, we know that the imperialist powers are moving towards further aggression against China, the latest maneuver being the military deal and formalized partnership between the United States, Australia, and the United Kingdom. And while the US is boosting its military presence in the South China Sea against the backdrop of the ever-increasing urgency of our global climate crisis, China has committed to addressing climate destruction and is furthering domestic and international policies that are centering humanity. This is shown in their ability to expertly slow and stop the spread of COVID within China, and their international solidarity support of the people of Cuba, Iran, Venezuela, and many other countries that are strangled by US capitalist agenda. We're holding this forum because we want this to be a space of fruitful discussion and debate for all of us who see in China the ability to challenge US imperialism, US hegemony, and the global dominance of capitalism. So before we commence, I have some other housekeeping things to address. We're asking everybody inside to keep their masks on unless you're eating or drinking. You can purchase snacks and drinks, including beer and wine, whenever you want, at the front at our cafe. And we encourage everybody to browse and purchase books from our bookstore, 1804 Books, which is also at the front. And so I am very honored to pass it off to Michelle of Qiao to give us our opening keynote.
Hi, thank you so much for coming. First off, I just want to give a huge shout out and thank you to our co-host, the People's Forum. They've done so much work. Thank you so much. This could not have been done without them, so thank you. And then second, I wanted to just thank our co-sponsors, Monthly Review and Code Pink. And I wanted to just say it's of immense importance to us in Qiao Collective to host this conference as an opportunity to bring together people to discuss, meet, strategize, and build momentum towards challenging the rise in imperialist aggression on China. It's not an easy road to walk, but it's one that we take, and we are glad that you guys are with us on this road. The past few years, we've seen an alarming escalation in US-led aggression on China, including the expansion of US military presence in Asia and the Pacific, information warfare, and media propaganda. We have seen a brutal hybrid war being waged against China and trade aggression against China, including, but not limited to, a US-led imperialist bloc, including Australia, the UK, France, Germany, Japan, South Korea, and India. We have seen these countries' internal industries, from the military to media to academia, mobilized to facilitate this imperialist aggression. At the same time, many self-avowed leftist organizations and thinkers have abandoned an anti-imperialist analysis of China in favor of equating narratives about Chinese, quote, authoritarianism. I wanted to start off my keynote with some information on Qiao Collective. So I'm one of the founders of Qiao Collective, and our origins illuminate various themes that I hope will underpin this conference. Qiao Collective is a collective of Chinese people, both diaspora living in the West and in China. We're a small group who are focused on challenging US aggression on China and promoting anti-imperialist internationalism. We are a group of writers, artists, and researchers who have taken on the task of mounting a challenge to escalating US imperialism on China. We gave ourselves the name Qiao as a play on two homophone words, Qiao from Hua Qiao, which is the Chinese word for diaspora Chinese, and Qiao from the word Qiao for bridge in Chinese. We hope to provide as a bridge to China, and learn what we know of China through our experiences in and with China. From being born there, growing up there, as Chinese Americans with family and friends there, we sought to serve as a bridge to the Western world to show what we knew of China. Not the authoritarian tropes we see plastered across Western media, but instead a flourishing, imperfect socialist project that has brought enormous levels of progress and advancement for our families. We also wanted to subvert the traditional role often performed by diasporas of official enemy nations. From diaspora Cubans to diaspora Chinese to diaspora Iranians, the diaspora in the US and the West has long weaponized their identity to serve as native informants to grease the wheels of imperialism against their home countries. Our collective, like each of our family histories, have diverse backgrounds and relationships to China. Our parents and grandparents have been from the city to the countryside. They have fought Japanese invaders in Dongbei and US imperialists in Korea. Others fled the Russian revolutionary tide for Taiwan, Hong Kong, or the West. My parents protested at Tiananmen. Others lived China's socialist project through generations of progressive material benefit. From rice rations and smuggled eggs to high-speed infrastructure reaching deep into rural countries. These diverse vantage points give us a unique perspective on the struggle of the Chinese people over the last century to overcome imperialism, feudalism, and poverty. We formed in January 2020, right when news of COVID-19 pandemic outbreak in China occurred. It was a distressing, painful, and scary time for so many of us. During the months of January to April 2020, many of us spent our days calling our relatives on the phone, crying, scared for the stability and safety of our relatives in China. As Chinese people literally died in the grips of a mysterious virus, we saw Western media gleefully go wild with false propaganda, hailing the COVID-19 outbreak as the end of China as we know it. From now fully debunked propaganda about supposed whistleblowers to glowing coverage of the right-wing Hong Kong protests to gleeful predictions that COVID-19 would kill more and more Chinese people, many in the Western allied world and media, on the left and right, were rejoicing. All the while, there was oftentimes not a peep from many self-avowed progressive groups, and certainly no aid. It was only when the harm and violence of this xenophobia started impacting Asians in the US did we see a few voices emerge. This is a common and disturbing dynamic that we hope to address. It was during this time of grief that we formed Qiao Collective. It was the culmination of years of watching the US government intensify its focus on China and Chinese people. We have seen this in our communities, in our families. I have seen family friends arrested by the DOJ and FBI's China initiative. We have seen our friends and our family be denied visas to the US. Red Scare McCarthyism is not a thing of the past, it is happening now. The Cold War never ended. From the economic imperialism of the US trade war, to the rapidly increasing military buildup around China, to the massive media propaganda campaign, we are in the midst of a full-blown hybrid war in China. Today is the day that we call this unbridled, unhinged imperialist aggression on China for what it is, a new Cold War on China. Now, I'd like to turn to some historical and the personal to draw some overarching themes that I hope will define and underpin this conference. The Western pursuit of China and its vast market and trade and resources has long animated Western imperialist aggression. From the Opium Wars to the trade wars, US pursuit and dominance of China's economy has long animated this aggression. From the 1600s, tales of China's vast riches and natural wealth and resources drove Western colonial explorers to find what they viewed as the coveted jewel of Asia, the uncaptured jewel. The 1800s and early 1900s saw the creation of colonial concession zones in Shanghai and Guangdong, the taking of Hong Kong from China, and the military and economic domination of China by Western powers, all in pursuit of capturing China's vast wealth and resources. Then came the US's failed attempt to back a right-wing political party to defeat the Communist Party of China in 1949. When it became evident that this party would fail, the US, on the eve of its invasion of Korea, annexed the island of what was then called Formosa to give this party a second life. This is a story of colonialism, the pursuit of the once lost China, the loss of China that has animated Western narratives of modern China since the very beginning. In fact, the West has long believed that when China began its opening and reform period during the 80s and 90s, it would plan to join the global neoliberal order and become a part of the imperialist bloc as a junior partner. However, China has always made clear that opening up and reform was not about becoming a client state of the US empire, but instead about solving the real problems and poverty that it faced. Today, American companies and US government release reports evaluating China's vast untapped market of consumers and workers as the tinder they need to fuel their capitalist systems. Western finance firms salivate at the thought of breaking into China's market, while Western governments chafe at China's strict financial regulations, preventing their companies from owning and dominating China's domestic industries. The US-China trade war is an example of economic imperialism at its finest. The trade war was about forcing China to give up its sovereignty via economic warfare. From forcing China to remove its restrictions on foreign ownership of capital, to forcing China to allow and make more porous American financial institutions to come in and set up shop, to breaking apart China's state-owned enterprises, the core of China's market socialist economy, the US has and continues to this day to engage in economic warfare on China with the aim of converting it into a neo-colony. Thus, from opium wars to trade wars to the current hybrid war, we must understand that Western colonial imperialist aggression has always been about breaking China, tapping into its vast market and resources, and subordinating China to colonial position. Make no mistake, the narratives of protecting liberal democracy merely serve as cover to grease the wheels of this economic warfare. Against all odds, China has built an economic system that resists Western economic control, with massive support from the Chinese people. China has built a flourishing, flawed, imperfect, organic socialist project. Socialism with Chinese characteristics has proven to work for the Chinese people. As shown by the recent tightening and regulation of tech companies and enforcement of public good policies in China, capital is subservient to the state. In contrast, we have seen here how the state is subservient to capital. To those who have never had to truly build something and fight for socialism in a world of sanctions, missiles, and imperialism, socialism is the perfect utopia, born of moral purity rather than struggle and compromise. Yet we know that what to the West reads as illegitimacy is in fact the science of socialism, which is about providing material benefits to the people. It is a science and a practice. It is not perfect and it is not utopia. It is about building roads in poor villages. It is about CPC members going to villages in China and installing plumbing. It is Chinese government workers drafting regulations to restrict foreign investment. This is the reality of creating a living, thriving, and growing socialist project for 1.4 billion Chinese people. Socialism is a process, not a state of being, and the nature of imperialism is to strangle the socialist process. The socialist experiment before, to paraphrase Deng Xiaoping, we are able to build a socialist society that is materially superior to the capitalist world. Now, I would like to turn to another alarming aspect of the US hybrid war on China. The US militarization of Asia and the Pacific under the auspices of the renewed US quote-unquote containment doctrine of China. Over the past several years, we have seen a massive, alarming reconfiguration of the US military apparatus to target China as the quote-unquote enemy nation du jour. From Obama's pivot to Asia, to Trump's Cold War rhetoric, to Biden's labeling of China as our quote greatest enemy, the US war apparatus has zeroed in on China as a threat to the US-dominated global order. We have also seen a pathetic failure from some groups within the Western sphere to challenge this reconfiguring of US imperialism to target China. Just a few days ago, the US, UK, and Australia unveiled a new security partnership named AUS-UK, which involves the exchange and sales of nuclear submarines and weapons technology to Australia, a clear act of nuclear proliferation. Just 2 weeks ago, the US and South Korea ignored pleas from the DPRK and China to stop their war drills. And in the past few months, the US military has tested nuclear missiles in Hawaii, deployed more THAAD missiles to South Korea, and deployed bomber jets to Guam, calling for a $20 billion increase to fund their plan to, quote, combat China. They've sailed missile warships into China's waters, all to contain China and encircle it in what the US government has called, quote, the perfect noose to hang China with. And China is not the instigator. It is the US that is unilaterally driving a deadly buildup of military apparatuses in Asia and the Pacific. from deployments of weapons to warships to planes to bases. The US attack on China concerns much more than China itself. Underpinning it is an enormous military archipelago stretching from the Pacific to the Indian Ocean, encompassing many nations and people whose lifeways have and continue to be crushed by US militarization. The same US warplanes that are doing freedom of navigation flights into China's airspace are taking off from military bases in Hawaii and Guam. The same US naval ships and nuclear missiles that perform exercises in the South China Sea depart from highly controversial and contested US military bases in the Philippines, Okinawa, Busan, and South Korea. US empire is built on the destruction of indigenous lands and lifeways. The false narrative of the China threat and renewed US Cold War aggression on China is not only detrimental to the Chinese people, but also detrimental to the people in Asia and the Pacific. We at Qiao Collective also unequivocally reject the false equivalence of the US and China as supposed equal inter-imperial rivalries. This is yet another narrative used by the self-avowed left to grease the wheels of imperialism and align with their right-wing counterparts in supporting the US hybrid war in China. We reject the moral cowardice and historical ignorance of the self-avowed Western left that has coalesced behind the neither Beijing nor Washington line. This position obscures more than it clarifies, and is a de facto consenting to the anti-China propaganda, sanctions, and militarization we see happening right before us every day. This is not okay. Make no mistake, US military escalation in Asia and the Pacific is a bipartisan issue through and through. Republicans and Democrats are essentially competing now to prove who can be toughest on China. Meanwhile, many progressives and liberals in talking points or policy stances have offered no meaningful alternative to this bipartisan escalation towards China. This is the inevitable outcome of the left and right's consensus on the China threat. Shame on those supposed leftists who, in repeating State Department talking points under the guise of nuance, have helped manufacture consent for US warmongering, not only on China, but on countless other global South nations. In order to disarm the US empire's framing of the Asia-Pacific conflict as a strategic terra nullius for US military and economic supremacy, we must highlight people's struggles under the rubrics of internationalism and anti-imperialism to pose an alternative vision for Asian and Pacific futures. Recently, as the US's aggression against China, Cuba, Venezuela, Iran, the DPRK, and countless other countries have barreled on in full force, contentious discourses amongst many in the left/progressive world has erupted. We have found that oftentimes a camp that has taken to fetishizing eras of dogmatic socialism, mass poverty in the global South, have also taken to deriding and dismissing the imperfect practicing socialism of countries in the global South in the modern day. The truth is that no perfect socialist utopia exists. That is impossible in our current capitalist world. And to demand that level of perfection is to know that it is a test that no country will ever reach. Destruction is oftentimes a necessary route to socialism, but after that comes building a socialist state that provides stability and nourishment to its people. The systems built by a revolution are just as important as the system it destroys and abolishes. In response to the question, don't you want to abolish the state power? Mao Zedong replied, yes, we do. But right now, we cannot do it. Why? Because imperialism still exists. Because our people are still poor. Because domestic reactions still exist. Because classes still exist. It's easy to sit from within the one's perch in the imperial core to chide global South countries for not doing enough. Oftentimes, I'm confronted with people imploring us, denounce China. How could you do this? How could you say this? Just come out and denounce China, please. But China's not free, they say. We just need to organize Chinese workers. That's what we need to do. Organize the Chinese workers that are waiting for us in the West to go organize them. That is what we get told on a near daily basis. I just wanted to demonstrate with these examples. To them, China is the epitome of Oriental despotism waiting to be saved. But perhaps it is not the Oriental who requires enlightenment, but instead it is us in the West. Perhaps Chinese people are not the brainwashed ones, but instead it is us in the liberal, supposedly free world. Perhaps they are not the impoverished ones, but instead it is us. Ultimately, the Orient has become a mirror upon which the West projects its worst sins. In fact, we in the imperial core, I have found, are the unfree ones. While we are granted empty abstract rights and get to vote every 4 years, people every day in this country die from lack of adequate housing, food, and economic rights. This is not true freedom. As the US has now reached 667,000 COVID-19 deaths, and let me just make that clear, 667,000 people have died from what is now shown to be a preventable pandemic if you look at China's pandemic policies. These are 667,000 people who could still be alive to this day. I'm reminded of a quote by Kwame Ture. Is it not violent for a child to go to bed hungry in the richest country in the world? I think that is violent. But that type of violence is so institutionalized that it becomes a part of our way of life. Not only do we accept poverty, we find it normal, naturalized. This rings especially true to me these days in light of the current pandemic situation of COVID-19 and how the US's and Europe and Western world's failure to control the virus has led to what can only be called a mass genocide. These countries' privatized approach to pandemic response has resulted in essentially what can be called a genocide of epic proportions. And yet, this violence has become naturalized, called an inevitable result of the capitalist machine that must keep churning. By contrast, my family members in China are safe. I don't have to worry about my elderly relatives dying from a preventable pandemic. This year, the Communist Party of China announced that they have eradicated extreme poverty in China. Yes, let's hear it up. This is the product of 70 years of struggle. I have seen with my own eyes the unimaginable, awe-inspiring improvement in the quality of life of my family and my relatives in China. As recent as the 90s, there was severe poverty in China. Of course, there's rampant social inequality and still serious social issues, but basic things like lack of adequate food, materials for clothing, metals for machinery, basic plumbing, water cleanliness, medicines were commonplace issues in China until recently. As Deng Xiaoping said in 1987, as the reform and opening up period was just getting underway, poverty is not socialism. To build socialism, it is necessary to develop the productive forces. Within my parents' and grandparents' lifetime, this lack has been transformed into abundance. They have personally witnessed, experienced, and reaped the rewards of China's market socialist economy. Their lives have seen monumental improvement. When my mom was a kid, my grandmother hand-sewed every piece of her clothing, including her shoes. Her shoes were made from cloth that my grandmother had to buy. Why? Because her region lacked the productive forces, from the factories to the skilled technical knowledge, to the metal to create the factory pieces, to the ability to train skilled workers. It lacked the productive forces to produce basic clothing and shoes. Now, my relatives and family have been educated for free at China's public universities. They never have to want for basic clothing, food, and medicines again. They're reaping the fruits of socialism with Chinese characteristics. Oftentimes, these accomplishments, these monumental, earth-shattering accomplishments are far too often dismissed by those in the West, by people who have never had to experience that level of poverty, by people who will never have to experience that. It is only through the blood, sweat, and tears that socialist Global South nations have engaged in the struggle to build socialism. Countries like China, Cuba, Vietnam, the DPRK, to name a few, have undertaken the imperfect, difficult, and arduous task of building socialism in a capitalist world. These countries do not exist to satisfy the fantasies of Western purists who demand ideological perfection while failing to even marginally rein in their own Western nations' imperialist war drive. But contradictions abound in the creation of socialism in a capitalist world. We're the first to admit it. It is not a perfect practice, but we must learn from these nations, not demand perfection while our own countries terrorize, sanction, and attack them. To close, We are in a dangerous time. The US is gearing up for aggression and military violence on China that would devastate not only China, but its people and every country that China is in solidarity with. Any true anti-imperialist movement must unequivocally oppose US aggression on China. No more both sidings, no more nuancing war. All those who propagate false narratives to attack China directly contribute to this US imperialist violence, not just on China, but on every other country in Africa, Latin America, the Middle East that China stands in solidarity with. Ultimately, as people from within the imperial core, we at Qiao Collective view our principal job as socialists and anti-imperialists to be to destroy the US-led empire and the system of global capitalism that it mandates, not to debate the character of global South countries targeted by our own country's aggression. The question is, as the US gears for war in Asia and the Pacific, what role can we have with our principled critiques besides naturalizing US empire's economic sanctions, militarization, and strategic support of right-wing color revolutions in the name of democratization? At a certain point, we feel that the debate should come second to the primary question. What is our theory of change, principles, and priorities as socialists in the imperial core? We at Qiao Collective like to be pragmatists. What can we actually do? What can we actually impact? The fight for socialism and against imperialism is not just a political one, but a personal one. To many outside of China, China is the ultimate boogeyman, the orient for them to project upon it the West's own capitalist and imperialist sentence. They cannot comprehend that China is a real place with real people, our families, who deserve to be treated with humanity. Our fight against xenophobia and the imperialist aggression it justifies continues in defense of our friends, families, and communities who have lost loved ones or been harmed to the schemes and hatred of the US empire. In this spirit, we as Qiao Collective hope that this convening provides a space for developing critical analysis of the renewed Cold War aggression on China, as well as its ramifications for Chinese socialist development and internationalist struggles against militarism, colonialism, and hybrid war across the global South. Thank you very much. Thank you. So we're just going to be taking a short 5-minute break while we set up panel 1, which will be starting in a few minutes. Thank you.
I thought that